All right, so I'm just going to lay out the pitch. A number of you have heard it before, and then we'll go from that story to some kind of analysis, right? Then we'll start going from that analysis to some sort of agreement, hopefully, or at least some theories and that sort of thing. All right, so I'm going to move the chairs out of the way. So there is a thing called Learning Registry. That's on the plus side. There's a set of services that exist that we've worked hard to build. So that's what we have today, roughly speaking. We have a publish replicate injection, we have a replicate out into a network and back into replicate, and then we have OAI PMH as a way to get back XML content. Unfortunately, it's only XML content. It has not quite query, but filter capabilities. Is that a fair way to describe what it does? There's obtain, fairly simple. Slice has some capabilities. People continue to ask for more. And then harvest, which is, very similar to replicate in terms of what you're extracting. So that's essentially the architecture model for Learning Registry today. I will make an assertion. So this is where we get into the value proposition that I'm trying to get to based on the strategy we talked about earlier about state first and curricular alignment and stuff like that. That the value proposition would be what we're doing in Learning Registry, which is not common, is unusual, is remarkable, is the publish replicate out to the cloud, the distributed data network, right? So these sets of services. That's what Learning Registry does that we think is different from how it's been done before. PubSub, Hubbub doesn't do this. OAI, PMH endpoints, generally speaking, don't do this. This data replication network, this community of sharing, it's a policy and political activity, which is saying, you people need to put into here, and you need to replicate with others so that they can get access to your stuff, both discover it and exchange it and filter it, and but that this data needs to get out, not everyone just hosts their own, and you have to figure out where it is, and so forth. We don't know that this is the right way to approach this, but this has been our hypothesis for quite a long time that this is a really important thing to be doing, and is innovative. So if it is important and right, it's something we're competing against nothing in sort of Clay Christensen's world. This is valuable. These things we have built because without access to this cloud network, this is not a very valuable activity. Fundamentally, applications of various kinds, whether they be search engine operators or much further up the stack in LMS and WordPress or Drupal, they need to rely on something over there, like these sets of things. Does this feel like a fair characterization of where we're at? Please.
Except for persistent data store.
Oh, yeah, so you're referring to the previous diagram that I had?
No, I'm saying one of the characteristics of what we have now is that it's a persistent data store. You're not just, sending the data around and it's gone.
It's funny because I had that exact word in place of LR on the last diagram. If anyone remembers that. So in fact, we totally agree that LR, in fact, itself is a persistent data store through which there is this flow of replication and publish. Yes.
Just one observation that you could make that happen. It seems like by standing up your own node and this replicate process, and then just plugging it against your local calculations.
You could plug the app directly to Harvest. That's what you guys do, which is essentially plugging directly to replicate. It's effectively the same feed. It might be slightly different technology, but you're just saying, from this point forward, show me everything you got, and then I'll figure out whether it's useful or not. So absolutely. That's, to me, a pretty high bar. In fact, you need to be technically pretty sophisticated to pull that off. And even the technically sophisticated potentially don't want to do that. So then you say, well, you slice to get a data pattern out, and that's not bad, although we've bumped into some limitations of we've engineered Slice, tried to do a good job. Smart people have worked on it, and it has an extravagant data footprint and doesn't necessarily have the performance characteristics of some tools like Lucene that would give you a lot more in a smaller footprint and higher right? Because there's been a lot more people working on those problems and so forth. So there's that. Obtain, doesn't do much. There's nothing wrong with it per se. And OAI-PMH has this dramatic limitation that the spec doesn't permit JSON to outflow, so that's very annoying. In addition, it potentially doesn't have some of the slice characteristics or some of the higher order query capabilities that you would want in order to extract data that match your needs. Now so there's some other things that I'd like to talk about with regard to other features, but that's to me the next natural pivot in terms of my argument for a data services strategy here. But just to make sure, in this characterization before we move forward, that I'm not sort of enforcing an agreement on architecture that doesn't correspond to what's reality or what you think. Feels all right? Okay. So I'm making a case that in addition or potentially ultimately replacing these sets of services, that we could go after some sort of data service strategy that would involve leveraging a community that provides many of the requirements, not these capabilities, but the reason why people want to use these things. So we can get into examples of technology, but I wanted to talk about what are the things that people need to build applications to get to here, some of which we provide here and some of which we don't provide here. And then we can talk about, well, we can just custom engineer the things that aren't there, put them into our stuff and support that. Or is there a technical, tactical, and strategic reason to migrate to something else that might be actually easier to get those features in and get these for free, and that in fact if we just, as you said, we didn't do it, but if we did do something along data strategy along these lines at some point, we open up a lot of possibilities for much more innovation. That's the hypothesis. So that's the case I'm making about data services. And so what would those look like? So I'll just start listing these out that I see, and then we can have a conversation about whether those are important or the wrong ones, or it's a complete list, or would be, except you're missing a vital linchpin. There's essentially data, what do you call, schema validation. I think we hear this a lot, which is just because it says NSDL-DC, is it NSDL-DC? There's one service up here which we could add, which is well-formed payloads. We currently validate that the JSON you submit is valid and conforms to a particular structure, so the envelope up here, but we don't validate if you have in your payload schema a tag that says XML, is that XML actually escaped correctly and all the things that XML has to be. So that might be nice up here, but we wouldn't be saying it means anything. We would just be saying it doesn't. It pops back up to the same. The levels are all matched. The braces are all there. The quotes are all right. Just all the things. Yeah. Over here, a data service that I think is very high value and potentially doesn't need to get reinvented over and over, doesn't steal value from commercial service providers, is schema validation that helps you say, and it might not be for all schemas, but we might provide for common schemas in the Learning Registry community. We can guarantee you that it conforms to what you think it conforms to. Be value that. Schema validation. I can't remember the word I used yesterday. I'll just call it data presence. Which is essentially saying, within NSDL-DC, I only want to see stuff that has curricular alignment data. So if the curricular alignment data is not there, or the title isn't there, or the whatever it is, I don't want to see it. It's not going to be meaningful to me. So it's just filtering down. It's not quite query, right? But it's filtering down according to the schema. So you're saying, I've locked into a schema, and if that schema doesn't have certain data values in it, it's ultimately not useful to me. Right? Sorry?
I think you use constraints.
Okay. Data constraints. So that's another feature. Another one is sender validation, which is just to say the sender is who you thought it was.
I'm sorry.
Is this not
Data
productive?
no, no.
Oh.
Data constraints isn't a verb, so.
You could call it constraining.
So the verb is, and you're not using filtering because.
We could use filter. I mean, filter to me takes on a little bit bigger scope because I'm talking about elements in a validated schema rather than filter, which might refer to cross schemas or. I'm fine with the word filter. I got no doubt. As long as we know what function we're talking about.
Okay.
Which is this is aligned to this, and to some extent this is aligned to that. But a lot of times people are just consuming data, and at this point they're probably not doing a lot of validation on sender. They're like, yeah, but if you signed it, I bet it's right. I bet that hash matches. So it would be nice. Over here, I think there's some work we could do on giving a service to make it simpler by allowing people to stand up a node and set up their own private keys and have it signed automatically. And then over here on the outbound saying, I trust my node. We talked about this, a year ago. I trust my node, flip the switch, and the node tells me that the data are good. So I don't have to deal with that. So these are all, to me, reasons why you would install a node in addition to the other things that we're getting here. That you would start saying, well, the Learning Registry public node can't possibly do these things for me because they're not going to host my private key. They're not going to, but if I installed my own node, I would get all these things. That's an example. And a node might not be a set of standard services here, but these would be things we tell you how to install in the same instance so that you get more functions. Sender validation.
But isn't sender validation, shouldn't that be a core function of the publish? Where you're doing the publish.
But it goes both directions, because ultimately, in the PGP model, it's the consumer who has to establish their level of trust, which is that message is in fact signed. So it goes.
That's different than sender validation, right? That's establishing your trust.
Well, there's a trust network here that I'd love to get to also as a service, essentially an identity graph along with a curricular alignment graph, where you say, I trust this, and so only show me. That's a little bit further out. Sender validation is simply saying it was signed through some mechanism here. It went through an arbitrary number of network nodes that I don't know, trust, or even can figure out where it went. Ultimately, I got a copy of it. Is the guy who signed it, claimed to sign it, in fact the guy, was it signed, was the data really signed by that person? And you can only establish that at the point of consumption. Okay.
Is sender the right, is it the word sender that's?
Submitter, do we have a
identity?
Publisher.
Publishers carry some weight.
Digital signature validation, that's really what it is.
Yeah, let's use.
We call it what it is. It's digital signature validation, which is that's the.
To me, I don't want to go down this path too much, but digital signature validation should happen at the node that you're submitting data to. That way, you're not propagating data that you cannot validate throughout all the nodes.
Agreed that should happen here as a benefit, but ultimately that's not security. That's just that's a supporting service. Ultimately, if the digital signature, because I could run a node that doesn't implement that, inject my poorly formed stuff claiming to be NASA into the network, and if I don't have a trusted place on the consumption side that actually makes sure that the NASA public key that I trust is the one that signed this data, not just the string NASA pointing to some random key, I have to have this on this end. I think you're right, it should validate up here, but it also needs to happen.
So you're saying it's not a requirement of the publish side, but if people want to have it as a function on the data services side.
It's a requirement that you can break that shouldn't break the security model.
Right.
So you're supposed to do it here, but if you don't, you cheat or do whatever. And like you could inject a public key that you don't own, and then sign it with a hash that it doesn't validate to that public key, put it in the network, and then what happens?
The onus is on the receiver to make sure.
Yeah, so this is the point of the trust but verify. Right. Yeah. Okay, and then there is some set of services. So this, and I think, Jim, you made a case that essentially I should draw a box around these. And we'll draw more boxes. And then there's some stuff that looks a little bit like query. And I think that you guys can give us some input as to how much are we stepping on your toes versus how much are we just adding value. And your points about where's the space for commercial operators. I think those are all really important issues. So for me, query is about saying, within the data set that I have that's validated against the things that I have, these are the things I need. I only want to see the NSDL DC alignment data that has the resource with youtube.com in it. It needs to have that string in the resource locator, resource identifier. That's essentially a query function, and a lot of people want that. Whether we ultimately provide it or not, I don't know. If it's easy to provide, meaning if we looked out to a set of to a data community that builds stuff, and they're like, get query for free, thumbs up. And then we don't say, here's how you do it with Slice. We just say, go ask that other community. Fedora Commons is one that we've kicked around just as a whipping boy, so to speak. So query. Is that clear what that sort of means? And then there's this conversation which leads to the one that you introduced, and this is the final point, so then I can shut off. But the final point, which is this sort of outbound data set, and it could be raw, right? So exactly what was put in, I get back out with these services on top of it. It could be, no envelope. So you pop out payload, and so what I get appears to be a raw API, and Learning Registry is just the service, and I don't know it exists. And what's great about this is if this is in front of you, you're getting a bunch of validation that makes this a fairly clean feed from that original data source. So you're getting a nice stream there. So there'd be reasons to take both. Because there's some metadata in the envelope that actually isn't always in the paradata, like the sender. So it came from NSDL, but it was in fact this validated teacher that did the alignment. If you want to know it came from NSDL, if you don't have the envelope, you can't make that assertion. There's someone, I can't remember who it was, apologies, was pointing out that there might be some, what you might call attribute injection in here, which is to say, if the sender doesn't validate, don't dump the record. Just inject a new field into the envelope that says, that was Jude? No.
That was John.
Oh, John, it was you? Thanks. That says that this signature is not valid, so that you can detect it down here. So you could actually say, kick out, if the schema is not valid, kick it out. Or if the schema is not valid, have an attribute that says schema not valid in the envelope so that rely on it, right, so that I can decide what to do with it on my end. There might be some higher order services like convert everything to XML and send me XSDs for certain well-defined, right, 1 to 5. There are 5 known data types for which we have XML, XSD conversion. So you can get paradata, or Learning Registry paradata structures, but we have a well-defined way that we convert that known JSON into this known XML. So that makes it really easy. For example, we heard from a couple of .NET developers that like, hey, if you give me XML, XSD, I just point my magic wand at it from .NET, and I don't have to do any work at all. Thumbs up, right? So that might be a real high-value feature. Right, and it goes on and on. You could have, a map to a CSV file or multiple CSV files, to unwind data structures if you just want to be doing bulk loads into databases for very simple data sets. And, play from there. Jim and I talked about, essentially, a model view controller architecture where you're just basically thinking of these as views, thinking of this stuff as essentially a data layer. The attribute injection might happen at the controller, and so that's the architecture that you're providing to people so that if they want to build new maps, new services, they can. We can provide some, and we give some core services in the model layer that are universal to all data things that are flowing out of Learning Registry. So that's my story.
So the data services are about things coming out of the learning registry,
Exactly.
correct?
Exactly.
So it's not the case that that is supplanting everything that we've already built.
Well,
Because OAI PMH we've used for data pump in.
yeah, but that's a totally different OAI PMH implementation.
This is only OAI outward.
Yes,
Okay,
there are two
okay, the one
OAIs.
he wrote up.
Right. Yeah, the data pump reads OAI, but it's I mean, you might have used some of the same code, but it's a totally different implementation
okay.
code
Yeah,
basis.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, just making sure.
But these,
So yes,
so
that's.
not the data pump, which is a data
So-
service over here.
Right. So the exercise I was going through in my head is how each one of those is satisfied by the data services. So now I see.
It could very well that, like we had discussed, that harvest could be one thing is that link between the persistent
Right.
store and the data services, where
The plug.
it's the plug, okay, and everything else is kind of more or less it is what it is. It is the right, because somebody could very easily, if they wanted to, as part of that, that view layer, have an outbound connection to Fedora, which
Right.
Fedora provides OAI PMH and probably way better support than we can provide. And then we don't have to maintain it. If they can go to the Fedora community and get their OAI support.
Right, so in fact, you are seeing rather than just views, but actual data services or data APIs bottomed out on this architecture. If we picked a winner here that actually gave us those for free, right, 2 thumbs up.
So actually, just with the Fedora example, if Fedora was the data server, if you can understand it, and the plug was harvest, it would seem like Fedora would know how to consume an OAI harvest, the PMH harvest.
Yeah.
more
It might be that we end up keeping our OAI
Right.
interface. However, OAI currently doesn't permit JSON, so it's highly
Yeah, it's
limited.
an issue.
So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
just
understood.
It's like if the output of that query, the view was to export out to Fedora, then Fedora is now the repo.
Yeah, Fedora has. I get it on the outside, but how do you get data from the persistent data store into the Fedora?
Well, David, what happens is from the persistent data store through, let's say, harvest right now, it goes to these data services layer, which we haven't defined what technology that's built on or how that works. But then somebody could create one of the views that we're talking about, that instead of spitting out XML to an HTTP response, it takes
It crosswalks.
Yeah, it's the proxy.
I'm just trying to think, how did you, so the data services are separate from, like, the Fedora Commons as a system that
Fedora
uses
Commons
data
isn't
services,
part-
or is the data services implemented by something like a
Fedora Commons is an external system to this.
Right, but to me, Fedora Commons is, as a
Yeah.
candidate, I'm not saying
Could
that's
be
the right
one
one.
of the systems
Right.
that
This
provides this
could
data
provide
services.
this
Yeah,
whole
yeah. So part of the question I'm just thinking through is how easy is it to populate a data service provider like Fedora Commons with the persistent data store data? I mean,
Fedora is built for this.
Yeah, although
I mean, not
personally,
this,
my
but
experience
for
with
consumption.
Fedora, I would not recommend it.
Right,
Yeah,
agreed. So
it's
let's
fine,
not,
yeah.
let's back up from that. We can talk about a different one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But let's talk about Cassandra. Or
Yeah, I mean, the data store is irrelevant, like where you put the data is irrelevant.
getting it in, yeah, so I don't think it's well designed, so it's a bad candidate in that we were going to ultimately reject it. I don't have a good one, or I would have named that one.
Yeah.
But what it does implement is a number of features on the bottom end, even though the internals probably aren't what we want. What I'm getting at is, I wouldn't worry about this, and I wouldn't even name what it is yet, knowing that it's going to be some kind of cleanish raw feed that will be defined by when we pick if we do this, and we find one that can do this, it will tell us how it wants to consume,
Right.
and we will build that.
Yeah, we want to pick
Now we
features
easy.
first and then technology second, rather than just deciding on a tech and then trying to shoehorn it in.
Right, which I feel like we've done a little bit of
Yeah.
up to now. So, right.
So the schema validation and data presence, so what would the schema coming from? Is that some own schema or the consumer schema?
So we might, depending on the tool, we might have to only build known schemas. So here's an assertion is, the community can communicate about lots of things, and we like that. And this is, I think, a very positive. Over here, if you want to communicate through the LR network in a format that's not understood by others in this room or in this community, fine. We like that. We think that's actually productive. We want that. However, there are schemas that we are all communicating with each other that we want to constrain and control. That's natural, that's reasonable, and that's not contrary to that original mission of all formats. So in that sense, we might provide, we say, there is NSDL DC, there is a particular brand alum, there is Learning Registry Paradata for curriculum alignment, there's Learning Registry Paradata for rating data, and there is the OER Commons quality rubric data in some format. That's it. That's all our community cares about, and all we do is validate of those 5. Now, we can tell you this technology can do additional validations, and here's how you build a validation, because this technology is built to validate. We might also, if you get it for free, say, if the XML comes over the wire with a DTD in it, we can validate against those DTDs for you, right there.
Or you can turn off the schema validation.
Or yeah, absolutely. Or you just take a raw feed, or it's not like we have to turn these off. But in many cases, I'd make an argument for if we were running this will probably be fairly heavy itself. In which case, we'd probably on that node turn off a lot of these because other nodes could run these, but this node would be providing a different set of services. Ultimately, I believe that when Dan built the spec, he wanted things to be, you could turn on and off different pieces. That was part of the design. So I think this is coherent there.
Then if the data doesn't pass the validation, you not have it?
Choice. You could,
Flag it.
in the service, you could flag it, and so you see it raw, but it's got an additional element injected, which is nice because you know the signature's already validated, so you don't have to worry about checking the signature again. So that's 2 nice things to go well together. Or you could set potentially a capability that says, I don't even want to hear about it. If it doesn't validate, if it's the wrong signature, and if it's not constrained to these sets, that's all I want coming out the other end, is that clean feed, which would be, from my perspective, for developers, getting them as close as we should to this, to getting them into their applications. Now, this may be unrealistic because it's too expensive, difficult, time-consuming.
So let me push on just push on an alternative here, or
Please.
talk about what what if we didn't do anything, or what devil's advocate, however you like.
Yep.
Why can't we just say that we've done slice, we've done harvest, and now we're going to do a schema validation feature, and now we're going to do a
Right.
I can't see it
Yeah,
as well as I
filter,
like, but
yeah.
do you see what I'm saying? We just keep adding on to that bulleted
Correct.
list of things, and now we've got a more complete set.
That's right. And so,
And why do we, and you've drawn a nice box, and we kind of see how it falls into the application. But do we need to do something fundamentally different to offer these services?
no. So we could engineer each one of these.
Mhm.
And so to me the question is, so there's one strategic advantage, which is if you implement this as schema validation and it's custom, then everyone has to learn our custom stuff to add more validations. That's one. And if you move people over to another service where you say, hey, in service X that is known to do schema validation, we have built these templates, and you want to figure out how to write more templates, go to them. Because that's the community where these templates are defined and the feature sets are, we just installed that in our system, so use it. So this is, to me, somewhat about pushing people to places where they can work and not just say, hey, you're Microsoft.com, build us new features, which is what I worry, and I think Dan, as I've talked to him, is worried. Not maybe, he hasn't seen this, but also worries, and not just to put him and me in the middle of it, but worry that we are creating a distributed repository portal system rather than a communication infrastructure. And this, to me, is pushing people over to say, hey, we recognize you need more than communication infrastructure, so let's go give you a community that's already building this
Why
stuff.
can't I just take, OAI, PMH, obtain, slice, harvest, add on
Right.
schema validation, add on filtering,
Right.
and put that in a box and call it data services?
We could. That is a very, and if that's cheaper, faster, and leaves people on the tail end with more capabilities, you know, so that they can add on, then we should do that. Absolutely. What I'm asking is, does there exist a toolbox, a data toolbox? I mean, the Java community goes deep into this stuff, so maybe we just start engineering, leveraging Java to do this because there's so many tools in that community. I don't know. But maybe there's more of an out-of-box solution that offers some of these so we can just build, because we're ultimately going to have to build some of this,
Right,
but we can
right.
glue and build those things in a data framework that people have already got running quicker.
So we'd be taking advantage of something that's out there to get, as opposed to saying, okay, we're going to have to go and handcraft schema validation, we're going to have
Yeah.
handcraft
Right.
queries.
So writing this in JavaScript in Couch strikes me as probably not the right road.
Right.
That's the pitch.
Okay, so the whole thing is, the research is going to find a data store that already does that, so we don't have to do it? Is that?
Well, and it's obviously not going to validate our schemas, but it's going to say there is, and you know, we might have to draw lines between these so that it's going to be a chain together, you know, Unix style. The validator chains to the other thing, chains to the other thing. That's possible, but we're going to say, what's the cheapest, easiest, high reliability way to do data validation that's out in the community, and and that's going to be compatible with our stuff, and what's a real smart way to wire it up to us, so that we can kick over when people complain schema validation is broken. Say, go onto that other list and post there. To me, that's a part of the strategy, is getting people to go to the communities where their problems are already being solved.
So it seems to me another impact is that in the case where we adopt this data services model, if we didn't adopt a data services model, we'd be wanting to optimize our persistent data store to facilitate the set of features on the top, right?
This set.
Correct.
Yeah.
Whereas what I think what you might be proposing is that the persistent data store is optimized for publish, replicate,
That's it.
and that's it. And these other, we don't have to worry about optimizing it for query or for slice or whatever. We're pushing that problem onto something else,
Exactly.
right?
That's my pitch.
So that's another reason for pushing to the data source. Okay.
Steve, I just to talk a little bit more about the schema validation aspect. And I wonder if some of that feature set needs to be pushed up into the publish protocol, in that you need a way to describe what you're validating against. And the whole point of validation is to be able to validate against a known schema. So being able to know what schemas people are publishing is important.
Correct. I agree. And we believe that the schema keywords, schema format keywords, offer that, so that you can indicate to the community XML, NSDL, DC. So it's sort of like providing, and in fact, if you have a MIME type, you know, text / NSDL DC 2.1 UTF-8 or whatever, if you have a MIME type that defines what you're sending, you know, then you can communicate with your community about that. And in fact, the schema validation will rely on those envelope elements, most likely, to figure out which schema it should validate. So we think we have a way to...
So that's already robust and unambiguous?
We think that we can get it there. Meaning, right now it's probably not robust and unambiguous because nobody's validating.
Yeah.
Right? But we do think we give you a way to indicate in the messaging framework what you're going to see here. And with keywords, we think you're indicating potentially some of this stuff too. You know, but what we're talking about here is potentially actually doing packet inspection to make sure that what was claimed is accurate. Because as you said, that's your life, right?
Yeah.
What's claimed and what is are different. And
yeah.
We're trying to give some services that will get the app developer spending less time validating.
I mean, it has to be crystal clear when somebody says, this is format X.
Mm-hmm.
You can validate that, and you know what to look for to validate that.
One feature, just thinking through on the validation side, that I thought about in this, as I was thinking it through last night, was we have digital signature identity, but we don't really have contact information in that. And in the old internet tradition, there was contact information was often provided in the protocol. It's kind of weird, but that, you know, you could get that. And so if in the digital signature you could have a admin email and data format email, or if you had a few emails of like, who should you reach out to if this stuff's broken or you don't understand it? You know, you could leave them blank if you want, they're not required, but it would allow the community to solve some of that, where if a validation engine is consuming and it's detecting a bunch of bad, you could even automate an email back to that group to say, this group is failing to consume your stuff. You know, whatever. But that would be, you know, it's not hard to add that in, but I think that would start down that road.
So, can you elaborate what's the data presence constraint for the video?
Yeah, so let's take a very simple example again, because we have experts in the room. NSDL DC, whatever version, I don't know what version it's on, but 1.1 or whatever. Yeah, .02. So that validates that format. You've got a well-defined DTD or XSD or something that allows you to know that this XML is structured correctly. Next step, well, you can say a lot of things in Dublin Core, but all I want to hear is data that's in this format and that is valid, that has these fields filled out or within this data range or somehow. So, for example, you can express standards alignment in Dublin Core, in NSDL Dublin Core. So I don't want to see any packets of Dublin Core coming from anybody unless it's got that data in it. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to say query could have some more sophisticated features like pattern matching, regular expressions, looking across multiple records, maybe even aggregate. I mean, this could, I don't know, but this one seems like a simpler thing that is actually pretty high value. That
just to, is it constraining the result set to schema?
Yeah, it's constraining the result set of a set of valid schemas. So you get your valid schemas, and then you constrain down that list to only ones that contain certain data sets. Because that's a really common use case in our environment is I only want standards alignment data.
Filtering by
It's
schema.
filtering.
No, not by schema, by
Schema content.
schema or schema elements.
Yeah, or
right?
schema values.
You're not talking about
I
a view
want to
filter,
only
you're talking
see
about data replication filter. You're saying the only data I want to keep. Because this is different than your view. This is, on my node, this is what I want.
That's
No,
no. So you
talking about a
could
view.
do
Right.
replication has filtering, right, over here too. So that's fine. But what I'm trying to do is say one community goal is to have lots of people replicating lots of stuff with each other. And if filter replication is your model for getting the right data into your app, that is counter to the community model of sharing as much as we can. So not everyone's going to carry a full feed, but using that as your mechanism to downscope to the right data set strikes me as not what we want to encourage. So this is actually saying, look, there's a large set of data over here. Some of it you and I use today, but you're still hosting it and replicating with others because you're a part of the community. And then here you can select down to the app. And you may say, I'm not going to host a lot over here, which is fine, right? But I just don't want to create an incentive. That's my goal. And this feature set in this app, if this app exists, or this system exists, this feature set might be much richer than what we've engineered on filter replication.
Steve, I have a quick question, and this may relate to a DoD requirement. In this diagram, I don't see traceability for data movement. So if data is getting from node to node, and this is not just related to this extension, but if you have a data service and it's pulling from a certain node and data has hopped from node to node, there may be a requirement to trace
The transit path.
Yes.
Or bang path, as they used to call it. Yeah, I don't think we've engineered bang path into the system. I think we have some thoughts as to how it would do. We are talking about altering the local data store. Right now we've got 2 copies of everything, but that local data store would probably be one of the mechanisms. One of the difficulties, right, why I think we chose not to engineer it early was that it sort of starts interfering with signature, because you have to extract those elements out after you sign, because they're global elements, but they are not compatible with signature. So you have to knock them out before you validate.
It also interferes with the update in
replication.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that I think was the one that we bumped into. It's solvable, but basically, if you modify the document with this data set, you now have a new version, and it's going to hit you back, and you get all this amplification problems.
So when we're looking at redesigning replication, is this something, or are you guys thinking of doing it with sequence numbers as opposed to having attached?
Oh, that's a separate, not really.
I think you're raising an important issue. I think to me, it's part of the mil spec requirements that we were talking about before.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, one way to avoid that is just, a single node loses the messaging and replication functionality. There isn't a traceability going through a system. I mean, how
And you have total
Sure.
control.
You guys have to decide, but if you decide that's a requirement, we know it's we can engineer it, but we decided it was not easy, and so we elected.
On the previous diagram, part of the kind of next 3 month scope was defining these and think about what these requirements are going to be. And so, maybe that's a good question. You go into that requirements definition discussion of, is it even realistic to think about a messaging framework like this working with multiple nodes in a .mil environment? Would the kind of suggestion you're making even satisfy some of the concerns, that would be raised in deployments for that?
Right.
That's all needs to get kind of clarified, I think, before the definitions process.
And if there's some hard truths about this replication strategy in military, then we're going to have to bet more on DoDEA for establishing value of this project, right? So we want to look at that pretty hard, I think.